Do you believe in luck or fate or fortune? Do you wish people good luck when they're going for an interview or when they're getting married or if they've got a particular appointment that they consider very important? In olden days, when a couple got married, the bridegroom would be given a horseshoe, which was supposed to be emblematic of good luck. Have you considered yourself to be lucky? Joking apart, we live in a world in which luck, in inverted commas, seems to play such an important part in the lives of so many. The gambling industry is evidence of this. Its commercial success is underpinned by this belief in chance. And all the game shows too. Many years ago, there was a song in a Hitchcock film in 1956, sung by Doris Day. This became emblematic of the beliefs of so many. The song went, "Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be." This is a song that resonated in football stadia as the fans latched on to the song and sang it for different purposes. Some sang it because they were rather skeptical of the possibilities of success for their team. Others as a chant indicating success. There's one team that sang it, "Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. We're going to Wembley, que sera, sera." Now, obviously, that is quite trivial. And yet, the reduction of what happens, all that happens to us, to chance, is a very seriously held philosophical position these days, and it underpins so much of postmodernity. And the philosophy has been given additional credence at the moment because of this dreadful coronavirus, this little globule, this microscopic globule, which has caused such damage throughout the world. And people are asking, how can you believe in a God of providence when all this is happening around you? And there's some in the Christian church who are finding this very difficult. And the question is often being asked, why? It's a question we can all understand. Why? Why? But there's nothing new in this question. In the 18th century, when just after the Lisbon earthquake in 1855, or 1755 rather, one of the French writers, Voltaire, wrote a book called Candide. He was a kind of prototype for Forrest Gump. Everything bad happened to him. And this book, Candide's philosophy, was based on that of Leibniz, that God was working out providentially for the good of his people. And this was the best of all possible worlds. Now, throughout the ages, this doctrine of providence has been under attack. And as we've said, even more so in our present day. And yet, it is fundamental to the Christian faith. It's John Calvin, who lived through considerable difficulties himself and had so many challenges. He said, having lived through wars, persecution, disease, famine, he said in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and I quote, "Ignorance of providence is the ultimate of all miseries. The highest blessedness lies in the knowledge of it." Ignorance of providence is the ultimate of all miseries. The highest blessedness lies in the knowledge of it. So we're looking at a very important doctrine this evening. It's a great privilege to be looking at it, but at the same time a challenge. Now, you've probably seen enough of me, so in order to give myself more space to put up some visual markers, you will not see me for a while. You'll be relieved to know. Now, first of all, a definition of providence. Now, I know that many of you have regretted that you did not go to a school in which Latin was taught. So now is your chance to catch up. Now, here is your CPD for the week. The word providence comes from the word providere or providere, which has two parts. Pro in Latin means forward or on behalf of, and videre means to see. So you might at first think, as many theologians have, that it means just to see forward or to foresee. And it does mean this in the book of Acts, I think, when it's speaking of Felix. I can't remember the reference now. And quite a few have stopped there. But I think that's only part of it. Of course, God knows what is going to happen. And this links, of course, with his being all-seeing, which Bill Dunlop told us about some weeks ago. But God is not a passive onlooker. He's not a spectator. He is right in there with Abraham. He is seeing on behalf of Abraham. He knows what is going to happen. It's all part of his overall plan. Wherever God is looking, God is acting. If God sees, he performs. When he sees, providence means he is seeing to it. His seeing is always with a view to doing. Wherever he is looking, he is acting. Where he patrols, he controls, says John Piper. You see, the word video is what most of you have on at the moment, the video, the seeing. And that is what God has. He sees, but the additional thing is, while you may be not participating at this particular juncture, God is. So providence is the act of God seeing to the universe and all in it. It means when God keeps the universe, when it's God speaking to the universe, he says, I'll see to that. When Abraham in the Genesis story, in Genesis 22:14, says, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide, he's saying, the Lord will see to it. The Lord will see for himself. And the Lord does see to it because he provides, first of all, the animal in the thicket, but then, of course, the ram, but then, of course, the Lamb of God. You see, there is action in the verb. The Lord will provide. And this is the first time we find the word providence in the Old Testament. Quite naturally, Abraham is anguished under a great internal struggle with God's command. As Abraham prepared to obey, Isaac asked him in verse 7, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham replied, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Abraham spoke here of Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. And of course, this passage looks forward, as we've said, to the ultimate provision he made by virtue of his divine sovereignty, the supreme Lamb of God, who was sacrificed on our behalf. Now, I'd like to look particularly at how the doctrine of providence applies to our daily lives, how our grasp of the providence of God will help us face Monday or Tuesday, or indeed the rest of the week and the future, and how it will help us consider the future of our church. So stay with me while we look at the more abstract theological part. If you can bear with me for a moment, let's see how the providence of God relates to other attributes we have been hearing about in the series. For example, God provides because he is also the everywhere God. He can do that because he's everywhere. He's not confined to one place. That's what Bill Dunlop preached on. God provides for his people because he is the faithful God, which was the subject of one of Ian Hamilton's sermons. God can provide because of his sovereignty that Patrick spoke of last week. He can deliver on account of his power, which we may be looking at next week. And his providence is ultimately good for us because it comes from his wisdom. This wisdom means really that God doesn't make any mistakes. Now, when referring to the providence of God, theologians usually distinguish between three aspects: preservation, cooperation, and government. Now tonight, we've only time to look at the first, God's providential preservation. And let's look at this in the three headings. First of all, his preservation of the universe and the world. How much do we think about God preserving the world that we're living in and all that is in it? The animal kingdom, the plants in the garden. God's scientific laws keep keep the world going and ourselves functioning. But when we see tsunamis, indeed the effects of this tiny globule causing so much havoc, we recognize just how dependent we are on God for preservation. As Wayne Grudem has said, no creature exists of itself, nor can it exist by itself. Without the continuous preservation of God, the creation would sink away. Hebrews 1:3 tells us that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. And the Greek word translated, I'm told, means to carry, translated uphold means to carry or bear. It does not simply mean sustain, says Grudem, but has the sense of an active, purposeful control over the things being carried from one place to another. Colossians 1:17 also asserts that all things hold together in Christ. Now, if Jesus were to let go, the entire universe would instantly disintegrate. How apt is the children's song? He has indeed the whole world in his hand. How precisely do the sun, moon, and stars know their courses and the time to rise and set? Psalm 104:19 tells us, the moon marks off the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. It's God who underpins all this activity. And the galaxies, when you look at the stars, which God created. But the stars could disappear, but his providence, his preservation sustains them. In Isaiah 46:20, it is said, lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. You see, the providence of God preserves the universe. What a fantastic, sustaining and preserving work God performs in his act of providence. This should fill us with awe and wonder. Is that the way we react if we go out, look up at the galaxies, look up the starry night, or just look at nature around us and see the provident hand of God, the plants that come through, all the things that sustain, that are indicative of life. But secondly, this preservation also extends to the church. And here we'd love to talk about the history of God's people. Just a few examples will suffice. What about the story of Moses? Was it mere luck, mere chance, mere fortune that he was put in the bulrushes and he floated there in a basket on the Nile? Was it mere chance that he found himself in the palace of Pharaoh? Was it mere chance that he was educated in what would have been the kind of Oxbridge of Egypt? No, it was God's provision. We could look at the story of Moses if we had more time. The wonderful providence of God, how God sustained and kept him in all his wanderings, and how he used him to deliver his people. And the great deliverance in the Red Sea, across the Red Sea, how he parted the waters. We think also of how the Lord cared for the children of Israel while they wandered in the wilderness, how he fed them with the manna and how he watered them from the rock. We can also think of other examples in the Old Testament, in exile, the case of Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. So many incidents where God sustained his people by extraordinary means. But it's not just in the extraordinary providences that we see God keeping his church in being. Sometimes it's in the most ordinary stories. For example, in the story of Joseph. Joseph's brothers, as you know, threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, lied to their father for years about his fate. And Joseph, there were so many reversals of fortune, people would have been asking, where is God? Just as they are today. Where is God's providence? God had said to Joseph he was going to be significant. How was that going to be worked out? Everything seemed to be working against him. There may be people here tonight who are saying, well, God has been telling me I'm going to be able to do this or that, but it's not working out. Everything seems to be going wrong. Look at the story of Joseph. Through the sin of the brothers, he was sold into slavery, but he became a favorite. He was then a favorite. Potiphar loved him, a servant of Potiphar, then Potiphar's wife. Because he wouldn't comply, he was then put into prison. Had he not been put into prison, he would not have been able to interpret the jailer's dream. And if the king had never dreamed, Joseph wouldn't have been sent for. So then Joseph ended up in Egypt, where he was made prime minister. And he was able to use his position to sustain the people of God during a period of the 7-year famine. If Joseph had not been in Egypt before the famine began, millions of people, including the Israelites, would have died. How did God get Joseph to Egypt? Providence. Seemingly adverse providence to start with. He allowed his brethren to cast him into the pit. But Joseph recognized God's hand was on his elevation to the position in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 15, Joseph understood God's providence in his life. He said, don't be afraid. For am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. God meant it for good. So often that is the case, in that things that happen which seem to be so adverse, but God brings good out of them. Now, the responsibility, obviously, we cannot diminish the responsibility of Joseph's brothers. They sinned, but somehow God was able to use that to bring about his purposes. We could easily spend the rest of our time looking at the philosophical debate, God's sovereignty, man's responsibility. The only thing I can say here, which may be of help, is that these run along parallel lines. I believe they meet in eternity. But we could move on to other stories. The story of Esther. What a wonderful picture of God's providence there. Even though God is not mentioned in Esther, we see his hand working day and night. It's a beauty contest, really. In a sense, it's an uncomfortable story in the Me Too age. But God is able to use even beauty contests, to bring about his purposes. How Esther is chosen, becomes queen. Look at the timetable this evening. If you reread Esther, the timetable of God's providence is how she was in the right place at the right time. And I think the story of Esther and how Haman, the wicked Haman, builds a gallows for Mordecai, and the other gallows that he is preparing for his own execution. But God, you see, God overturns all these things. He sees to it. That is providence. He sees to it. All the others around could not see God's hand except Esther and Mordecai, and the Jewish nation were preserved. The church of God in the Old Testament was preserved. We haven't time to look at Ruth. Wonderful story again. Some excellent bedtime reading here. If you want true romance, have a look again at the story of Ruth and God's providences, how it started adversely with a famine in Bethlehem, the migration from Bethlehem to Moab, and to the loss of Naomi losing her husband and sons, and Ruth staying with her. And when they come back to Bethlehem, what happens? In chapter 2, it says, Ruth just happened to come to Boaz's field, happened to come. That was her way, but the Lord was directing her steps. You see how God guides here. And she went back to Bethlehem, even the tragic circumstances of her life and of Naomi's life. God was showing that providential care that he alone can. So he's preserving the church in the Old Testament. He does in the New Testament, in the history of the church. We would do well to study the history of the church, to study God's dealings with his people over the ages. Because I think it's so important when we're talking about the situation in our own day, in the Church of Scotland, when we see churches closing. God is the one who preserves his church. In Isaiah 27, verses 2 to 3, God says, this is what I think about the church. This is my church. I sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it night and day so that no one may harm it. I don't think any gardener listening tonight would have had such diligence with regard to any plants they put into the ground, watering continually, guarding it day and night. That's what God does with regard to his church. Now, we're concerned about so many churches in countries where religion is banned. But God preserves his church. That is the doctrine of providence. He preserves a faithful remnant. Without going into details, because this will be on YouTube, you all know in some situations where God has been particularly active and provided and kept a remnant. Are some of you worried about the future of Sandyford? It's God's vineyard. You're worried about who will be the next minister? God's seeing to it. It's God's providence. He is seeing to it. Look at the history of the church and you will see and be encouraged from all that you see of God's intervention. He's not a spectator. Providence means he is there right with his people. He's not like some distant deity who is all powerful and great and wonderful. He is that, but he is right there with his people. He's apart from his people, but he comes down, and the person of Jesus Christ is right there. Well, we haven't got time to look at two other aspects of his providence here in terms of cooperation or concurrence and government. I was reading Dr. Herman Bavinck, who's the favoured theologian of Ian Hamilton, but we won't have time to quote him tonight. But let's look, as we close, at three aspects of how the providence of God can help us day after day. And here we go back to the Heidelberg Catechism, which speaks of a threefold fruit of faith, which is derived from trusting God's providence. In question 28, it says, what does it profit us to know that God created and by his providence upholds all things? And the answer, that we may be patient in adversity, thankful in prosperity, and for what is future, have good confidence in our faithful God and Father, that no creature shall separate us from his love, since all creatures are so in his hand, and that without his will they cannot so much as move. Let's look briefly as we close those three aspects. First of all, for ourselves, patient in adversity. You know, sometimes we hear that phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. That sounds good, doesn't it? But it doesn't always work out that way. But knowing that God is in charge and is working out all things for our good, does that help us? It should do. It's probably easier to say than to put into practice. What about Paul and Silas? Do you remember in prison? Having received such a, he put them in the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. They were sustained, their patience in adversity, sustained by God's providence. Or if you look at the Old Testament, remember in the book of Habakkuk, faith in God's providence is, the Catechism said, of the utmost blessing to the child of God. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labour of the olive may fail and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Maybe some of you are struggling financially as a result of the present crisis, or have a number of health issues, or as some of you have, you may have crushing burdens. In such adversity, God is there with you. God's providence that he's seeing to it. He's not a spectator. He's right there with you, as he was with Abraham. And God has allowed these things into your life in order for you to look to Jesus and to experience that special relationship that you have with him firsthand. John Piper rightly said, in all the setbacks of your life as a believer, God is plotting for your joy. But lest any here torture themselves, if you're struggling to make sense of God's providences for you, you're in very good company. Or I suppose I should say in very bad company, even though these are believers whom God has used significantly. Look at the mighty prophet Elijah in the midst of despair when he looks to the circumstances and not to the God who controls all circumstances. Then Jezebel, 1 Kings 19, 2-4. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. When he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, it's enough now, Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers. So easy, isn't it, for us to look at obstacles and circumstances. I thought about having the famous hymn by William Cowper about God's providence. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. When he wrote that, it was just after an abortive attempt to drown himself in the River Thames. The taxi driver who was going to drive him to his self-execution got lost in the fog and had to take Cowper back to his home. Fear can sometimes make us doubt God's control. As we heard on Wednesday evening, we must say with the psalmist, in God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do to me. Or again in another psalm, the Lord is on my side. I'll not fear. In all the setbacks, says John Piper, in all the setbacks of your life as a believer, God is plotting for your joy. Spurgeon tells a wonderful story about a Mrs. Hannah Moore who says that she went into a place where they were manufacturing a carpet. And she said, there's no beauty there. And the man said, it's one of the most beautiful carpets you ever saw. Why? Here is a piece hanging out and it's all in disorder. Do you know why, Mum? He asked. You are looking at the wrong side of the carpet. Now, which side of the carpet of our life are we looking at? We can sometimes see disconnected threads, sometimes the marks of sin, sometimes the marks of adverse circumstances. We see the less agreeable side. And we think that God's providence for us is all wrong. because we're looking at the wrong side. When we get to heaven, we will see the right side of the providence, the right side of God's dealings. And we shall say, Lord, how wonderful are your works. In wisdom you've made them all. Glorious are your works that my soul knows right well. Was it, I forget who it was who said, I think it must have been the Mystery of Providence man, John Flavel, who said, you can only understand providence in reverse when you look back. Sometimes we can feel that people hurt us and we find it very difficult to cope with that. Murray McShane, his advice on this is so helpful. He said, instead of looking at someone else's evil intentions, take 10 looks at God's providential purposes for you. How wise that is. And that was the position of Joseph at the beginning of our story, in the earlier part of our story. But the second thing, as we really hurry, thankfulness in prosperity. You know, there's a woman in our congregation, I think she's now passed to glory, and she began each day by giving 10 reasons for thanking God. When we consciously recognize, as the scriptures teach us, that God controls all that we possess, we'll be thankful to him. When we understand that even the very breath of life we have, the food we eat, comes from him, then we will be able to say with the Apostle Paul, now that, not that I speak in regard to any need, for I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The Apostle Paul, who knew many adverse providences in his life, was always thankful to God for everything that came from his good hand. We can thank God for the spectacular providences. If you had major stories of how your life has been preserved, was there a car accident in which you didn't die? Were you prevented in a driving or in any other ways, prevented by an angelic hand from doing something? Were you rescued in any dramatic way? Have you been spared accidents which might have left you paralyzed? You know, God has also given servants to all his people. That's part of his providence. He talks about the hosts of angels encamping around those who love him. The number of escapes we have known that have been mediated by the angelic host, the angels. If I asked you, how many servants do you have? I think you would think I was needing to go and see my doctor. But you know, we all do have servants if we're believers. They are the ones who minister to God, often minister to us. We can't see them. And this is not a wacky interpretation of angels. This is just the biblical notion of angels in the way that God provides, often through angelic hosts, provides for us according to our needs. The extraordinary providences and the ordinary providences. Every day, the fact that we wake up, we live and move and have our being in Jesus. See, God is working behind the scenes all the time in our lives. In the birth of babies, how wonderful to see Charlie and Reuben in our services. Are they born as Esther was for such a time as this? Open your diaries with me and open the word at the same time. Have your diaries in one hand and the word in the other, and see what God is doing providentially in your life. You see, the providence of God puts an end to any pride. How often do we have proud thoughts of ourselves? Yet everything is a gift of God. When we're talking about money, position, beauty, well, that's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? Intelligence, wisdom, talents, or anything else. All these good gifts are from God to bring glory to him. What does James says? Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. And then finally, the last fruit of trusting God's providence, which is mentioned in the Heidelberg Catechism, is the good confidence that we will be provided for in the future, both in body and soul, by our faithful God and Father. You know, unbelief says to us, this is as good as it gets. We're getting older. If we're in work with no more promotion, bodies are showing signs of wear. We're not in a relationship. Will Mr. or Miss Right ever come my way? And all the other challenges of the future, challenges with regard to family and friends. Unbelief says, that's as good as it gets. Faith, on the other hand, rests in the providence of God. In the words that the hymn penned, which we sung last week, it is well with my soul. This at a time when there was such an adverse providence for the writer who'd lost his children in a sea accident. But faith said, God cared for me so well in the past, he will care for me in the future. You've got mountains in your way at the moment that you can't seem to get round or get over. Look to God and his providence. Commit to God, and as he will meet with you. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he'll sustain you. And don't worry, Jesus said, and that's why we read that in connection with God's providence, says, why we read that as a second reading. Jesus said, don't be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. You know, in the present crisis, some of the supermarkets ran out of a lot of things. In the early stages, you couldn't get much. But you know, God's treasure storehouse never runs out. There's more grace and there's more grace. And you say, well, I had grace helping me over the weekend, grace to live and to cope with what I've got next week. Go to the storehouse. And can never exhaust God's supply. God says, Jesus says, even the hairs on our head are numbered, which is, I know, it's an easier task to count the hairs on the head for some than it is for others. Though I read somewhere that there are 100,000 or 200,000 hairs on other heads which have an average of the 3-year lifespan before these hairs fall out. That's a piece of useless information I add. But you know, nothing is too significant for God to care about, and nothing is too big. John Blanchard said, the same God who controls the sun cares for the sparrow. Why should we be anxious with regard to the future? And what, for some here, what if we are persecuted? Well, the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. All things. That doesn't mean, it means all things. Our church, our family, our friends, our future. We can have confidence just as Abraham had in God, because he knew Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who will provide. And in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided, God said to Abraham. That's the ground of our confidence. And of course, the greatest provision of all, the greatest providence of all, was not the ram in the thicket, but what the ram was pointing forward to, that is the Lord Jesus Christ, because God was going to provide something which would cost him more than anything he could afford, the death of his son and the separation from his son in that one moment in time. Why can we be confident? Well, the Apostle Paul says, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things. Oh, we've got plenty of what ifs. What if? There are so many unfinished buildings in our lives, aren't there? We have, but the great thing is, though builders in the construction industry have been furloughed, our God hasn't. He's working away 24/7, never sleeps. His videos never turned off, like that of so many here tonight. He sees, he's seeing to it. Some struggling, he's seeing to it. It's not the empty rhetoric of politicians, oh, you will get through, we'll make it. But by God's grace, through his providence, he will take us through right to the time when we shall be forever with the Lord. May the Lord help us to enjoy his providence and give him all the praise and the glory. Amen.